Let's talk about networking in a straight up, candid way. When most people hear the word networking, there's a bit of cringe. For a lot of professionals, networking feels uncomfortable, and not necessarily because they're not good at talking to people, but because it feels forced. It feels performative. It feels like you're supposed to say the right thing in the right order, and that somehow, poof, it magically turns the conversation into a job lead. That disconnect is what makes networking feel awkward and kind of cringy. Here's a key point that we really need to shift our paradigm about. Networking in job search isn't about selling yourself or pitching your background or asking people for favors. It's not like, "Hi, I just applied at your company. Can you give me a referral?" It's about building familiarity and context over time. When people know who you are and what you do and how you think, opportunities can tend to surface. But when they aren't familiar and context isn't there, those opportunities don't tend to surface. That's it. And when you approach it the right way, it actually feels more natural, more human, and kind of surprisingly low pressure. Most people struggle with networking because they walk into conversations believing that they need to impress someone or really quickly prove their value. And that pressure really changes how we show up in a conversation. We can tend to talk too much or over-explain our background or try to nudge that conversation towards maybe jobs or openings. And even if we're polite about it, people can feel it and understand that there's an underlying agenda. The reality is, people you're networking with, hiring managers, recruiters, other professionals, are not necessarily uncomfortable with networking itself. They're uncomfortable with being pitched before there's any context or trust. They may, however, be open to conversations or sharing insight, and they're likely open to helping when it makes sense, but they're not open to being treated like they're just a shortcut. One way to approach networking is to think of it as a shared professional connection with shared purposeful information at its core. What do I mean? You're trying to start a conversation to ultimately gain insight into an organization and understand how decisions are made, what problems teams are trying to solve right now, or where your expertise and your experience realistically may fit. When you approach networking this way, the conversation becomes useful to you regardless of whether it turns into a referral or not. And it can remove a lot of the awkwardness because you're no longer trying to perform. When you reach out to someone, especially on LinkedIn, the most important thing that you can remember is that you're borrowing a few minutes of their attention. Don't try and be clever, just be clear. Clearly explain why you chose them to reach out to. Maybe a connection that you two have, a similarity, or maybe some admiration for something that they've done, and not just that you want some help. This can give your message some credibility. And simply be clear that you'd like to connect with them on a professional level. No resume, no job request, no pitch. Your goal in this is to start a connection that leads to a conversation. Once your connection happens and your conversation begins, be careful not to try and dominate that conversation. Ask practical questions with depth. Ask what their role actually looks like on a day-to-day basis. Ask what skills or experience tend to matter most in their particular organization. Ask what they wish people understood about their field or their company before they try to break into that field. These are useful questions, and they also signal some maturity and some self-awareness. When it comes to talking about yourself, be concise. You don't need to give your full career history or maybe even a highlight reel. Just a clear summary of what you've been doing recently and what direction you're targeting right now is plenty. And when you do, lean into problems that you've solved and not just your titles. Explain things like you were brought in to lead through change or to build structure where there wasn't any. This can help the other person mentally place you beyond just a title. And that can be very helpful when they're going to maybe think about you in the future when an opportunity pops up. Once again, keep it simple. If the other person, if they want some more detail, Trust me, they're going to ask. Over-explaining is usually what makes things feel kind of salesy. You don't need to hide the fact that you're job searching, but you also, don't need to make that the center of your conversation. Frame it in a way that you're being intentional about your next move and having conversations to better understand where your experience may fit. You're gathering context before you make a move. Framing it like this shows that you're being thoughtful and realistic and not really desperate or maybe even passive in your job search. And be careful not to drop the ball after the first connection or conversation. Obviously, you don't want to annoy them, but if you have a good discussion and then you disappear, that typically doesn't really build anything. Networking works through consistency over time, not intensity all at once, and that's how you become familiar. It's also important to be realistic about scale. Networking that works is typically beyond just one powerful connection. The networking that we've been talking about here is what leads to job opportunities. You have multiple low-pressure conversations over time with a variety of individuals. People become familiar with you and your background, and when an opening comes up or someone says to them, "Hey, do you know a good candidate for whatever that might be?" your name comes to mind. That's how most roles are actually filled, not through intense outreach or constant asking. It typically happens through familiarity and timing. If networking has felt awkward or fake in the past, it's usually because we were trying to get something out of a conversation too quickly. When you slow it down and treat networking as more like relationship building rather than job hunting, it becomes much more manageable and really much more effective. While you're here, drop a comment down below and tell me about your experience. I'd love to hear how things are going for you. And if you'd like more direct help with your job search, my courses and coaching are at careeriq.biz. And also, if this has been helpful, please hit the like button, subscribe, and maybe share the video. Until next time.